Hello, this is Dan Hill. I am the president of a company called Sensory Logic, which was founded 13 years ago based on the breakthroughs in brain science and the opportunity to quantify emotional response. I have 4 books, including Emotionomics, chosen by Ad Age, is one of the top 10 must-read books of 2009, and my latest book, About Face, The Secrets of Emotionally Effective Advertising. Thank you for joining today. The premise that I started with, and I think any company that's serious about understanding emotional response, which will be all of today's listeners and participants, is that of course we have 3 brains, and they came during different stages of evolution. Now as a company, Sensory Logic does use eye tracking to capture the sensory response. That is vitally important because after all, I believe it's 22.6% of the brain is devoted to processing visuals. And in our normal business practice, we would also capture the rational response, doing so through verbatims, ratings, probes, and other exercises. For the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to concentrate on the second brain in the evolutionary cycle, which is the emotional brain. And as you can see from the quotes on screen here and the details, everybody, of course, feels before they think. The emotional brain came into existence before the rational brain. We feel 5 times more quickly, and the emotional brain sends 10 times as much data to the rational brain as vice versa, because as the Ledoux quote below indicates, those connections are simply much stronger running from the emotional brain to the rational brain than vice versa. So there is, in short, no objectivity and a tremendous importance to be placed on understanding the emotional response of the consumer. Furthermore, if you're going to take emotions seriously, as I'm about to argue, you need to look not just at the arousal or the engagement measures, which are vitally important, but to be able to move on to emotions in terms of valence. The positive and negative reaction is a starting point, but every emotion has its own meaning, its own significance. And to just take one example, we often say that trust is the emotion of business. If you look at the opposites, they would include, for instance, disgust and contempt, which are emotions that are essentially about rejection. After all, contempt makes a lot of sense as essentially an emotion of disrespect. I don't know anybody who likes someone they can't trust, and so that you would reject them, move away from them, have a lack of respect for someone that you don't think is honorable and authentic makes a lot of sense. It does on the personal level, and I would argue it does likewise in the brand-consumer relationship. So if you look at emotions the way that psychologists would, you of course move beyond the world is flat view of using a 7-point Likert scale. Columbus has sailed the ocean blue. We have a round globe. We have a much more robust way of looking at emotions if you take into account 2 measures, not just 1. So the first measure is arousal. What's the intensity of the response? How strong is it? I think of it as a bit like a thermometer. How much are things heating up? How much are you turning somebody on? So that's one dimension. And if you look at most of what is available for the scientific tools, the biometric, neurometric tools, this is really where they go to. They can do it often very well. But I would argue that ultimately arousal is only, probably 1/3 of the psychology and business weight. After all, choose your dictator of the week. It's someone that I would have a very intense reaction to, but not someone I personally would choose to do business with. That takes us to valence. Valence can be thought of as positive and negative. It can be thought of as likability. The term I prefer ultimately is preference. Do I win someone over? Do I build a brand through creating loyalty and repeat business? Now, that's how people emotionally net out. Am I won over? Do I feel the affinity for a brand, for a branded offer, a campaign, and so forth? I would argue, however, that during the exposure to a piece of advertising, it's not quite as straightforward. You can have a humorous commercial. You can have a problem-solution commercial. It can vary as to what emotions you're trying to create based on the nature of the script. Quite clearly with a problem-solution format, for instance, you want people to feel the pain the negative emotions during the problem so that the solution is worth more to them, that there's more of a transition. Therefore, I argue that the 21st century version of marketing is not just about being on message. It is also about being on emotion, creating the right emotion at the right time, that we are moving from talking points to feeling points, and we are trying to create the emotion that's going to spur people to get involved in the script, the depiction, and therefore moving them on to the solution as part of that. If we look at emotions, I'm going to start with kind of the most obvious rung of the ladder. Clearly, people have for a long time in market research tried to operate addressing emotions as they could through self-report. Now, at times, people have gotten fairly clever about doing this in terms of using what I call visual proxies, which can be anything from icons to photographs, sometimes showing a specific emotion even, for instance. This does try to draw on the property that 22.6% of the brain is devoted to processing visuals, but typically these icons are, these visual proxies are labeled, so there's still a language construction, and more fundamentally an issue I'd argue from a scientific point of view, which is that people do not think their feelings. They feel their feelings, and you know, that is the important thing for how you're going to move this forward. So when I'm looking at this, I really would draw a distinction between the two slightly, in that the use of a dial is a handheld device that you need to keep thinking about every second. Very often with the visual proxies, it's simply one reading on the back side. But in cases where it's tried to be used self-consciously, self-reflectively during the interview process, I think there are still tremendous limitations. To illustrate what I mean, this is taking data from one instance of a company trying to have people self-report their emotions using visual proxies during the duration of a 30-second spot. And this is composite data. This is not one individual ad versus another ad. What you have in red here is across numerous ads by a company using the visual proxies. And what you have in green is drawn from our 13-year database. Any TV spot or radio spot that we have tested that is 30 seconds in duration. Our tool is called facial coding. I will be explaining that momentarily. But my real point here is to address what I believe is the inherent limitations of trying to use a think your feelings rather than feel your feelings approach. So what we have in red is, as I said, on average, the level of people's emotional engagement self-reported during a 30-second spot. And what becomes quite clear is how it starts extremely low, but continues to gradually build up and in fact reaches its peak, its crescendo, at the very end of the commercial. What we have in green would suggest something that's, I believe, more nuanced, but also more realistic. We would argue, based on our historical data, that in fact the emotional engagement peak, on average for a commercial, will crest at 20 seconds, and secondary crest at about 25, and much earlier in the game at about 8 seconds. While Selfreport would claim that the highest level of engagement has continued to gradually move upwards and reaches its height at the end of the commercial, we would suggest that in fact it's the opposite, that the levels that occur here are as low or lower than the weakest points early in the viewing of a spot, because people are in effect being sold to. This is when the brand image appears, the tagline, things that make you feel like you have lost volition, that you're being sold to rather than buying, and that people are either bored or put off at this point in the commercial. So to wait to introduce your branding elements so late in the commercial is very risky indeed. On the other hand, we believe that the early part of the commercial, while difficult real estate, is not quite as impossible as self-report would suggest. Another way of looking at self-reported data, and I think it's interesting how much the self-report on engagement tracks to what we've seen from dial testing. This is not the only time that we've been able to capture data from dials, but it is very characteristic of what we've seen, which is it starts slowly. Once it picks up, it stays very consistent with slight increase and only slight variance. So if you were to keep in mind the self-report line from the last slide and this one, the correspondences and the limitations of self-report, I believe, become very obvious. What is below here is actually our own data from a client study, and you can see there's considerable variation in terms of how people are responding, and across three measures: the engagement level, when they're showing emotion, how much emotion they're showing, the impact, which is our term for the arousal or the intensity of the emotional response, how much you're turning them on, and the appeal score, which is the positive, negative valence, and could take into account whether you're on emotion or off emotion. The next slide is on alternative methods. Moving now into the scientific realm, there are companies and literature, limited literature, but some literature trying to argue for pupil dilation and blink rate as opportunities to capture affect. It can probably give you a reasonable read on arousal, but I would find that there's nothing out there in the literature that would strongly support its ability to take into account valence. Other tools that would also be in the arousal camp would include respiration and heart rate. I think for obvious reasons they can do arousal. Whether it flatlines, whether the response to advertising is a stimulus that's strong enough to get these functions robustly involved, I'll leave to those who can work with it. But I know that when I started Sensory Logic, I passed on these tools because I needed something that could get to the crucial valence dimension. My company did, in fact, use biofeedback, often known also as EMG for electromyography. It is a good tool in that there is fairly considerable track record, paper trail of scientific literature on it. Obviously, one could choose to put on numerous electrodes on the face or sensors. That will take more time. That will make the subject more self-conscious. If you follow the more traditional placement, which is merely 2 electrodes, you're only getting to 2 muscles in the face as opposed to 43. And I've tried to indicate that you are going to be missing 3 of the emotions. You will only, through the corrugator muscle over the eyebrow, get to one of about 8 ways in which 3 other negative emotions are shown. And unless you have a sensor that can pick up the muscle activity around the eye, you will be able to get a social smile involving the zygomatic muscle that arches away from the corner of the mouth, but not be able to capture the top box, which is a true smile reaction. For practitioners of EMG, of course, there's also sweat gland activity. My company did use this for 5 years. We may have callers who have had different experiences, but frankly, the only graduate program in America in biofeedback is in San Diego, where I started my company. My entire staff was PhD or ABD in psychophysiology. We did not, over time, find that the sweat gland activity was robust enough to be the measure we would have hoped it could be. Staying with the face, the tool that we moved to is called facial coding. It originated with Charles Darwin, who was the first scientist to take emotions seriously. Darwin realized that in your face you reflect and communicate your emotions. Darwin came to realize that even a person born blind has the same facial expressions as you or I. In other words, it's not socialized or learned, it's hardwired into the brain. Furthermore, the face is the only place in the body where the muscles attach right to the skin. So it's building off the same principles as EMG, but if you can do it visually, which you can, it means you can dispense with the sensors and the setup time and the self-consciousness for the participant. But even more importantly, you're moving from 2 muscles to 43 muscles in the face, so you're able to get a much richer index of how people are responding. Facial coding is at work in terms of being automated. I would argue that no one is credibly there in terms of covering the emotions, but it will happen, and certainly within the next 5 years would be my expectation. At present, it means that the best way to do it is to do the work very carefully with trained people on a manual basis, and that is something that Sensory Logic has done for over a decade now. I want to close out with just two other tools. One, which is being heavily used at present, is EEG. I'm sure there'll be participants on the phone who know the tool well and are practitioners. I cannot claim to be, but on the other hand, I have read the literature carefully and I've talked to experts in the field. And as clients may or may not know, there are obviously some fairly severe limitations to bear in mind, and I've tried to capture those. I think most important ultimately is that this has been characterized by people I talk to as a very sophisticated and somewhat complicated way to get at arousal, that it's really not capable of capturing the valence dimension, and even beyond that, yes, has some issues with artifacts and so forth that have to be carefully worked from by anyone who's going to be serious in the field. Presumably that is done, so my focus really is going to be on the inability to capture valence. The issues are probably threefold. I would start with the fact that the limbic system is deep inside the brain. EEG is a surface device, can go into the cortex but not deeper. If you resort to trying to do something on the forehead region, which is what this slide is addressing, not only the signal is rather weak, if you stay with a approach avoid left brain, right brain model, you can do reasonably well. The moment you transition that into being supposedly a valence reading, however, you have a fundamental fatal flaw, which is that if you look at approach, happiness embracing someone and anger wanting to punch someone and remove a barrier to progress are both approach emotions. Quite obviously, of those two, anger is a negatively valenced emotion, and so you cannot get to a true positive score. And unfortunately, EEG, one of its severe limitations is the inability to separate specific emotions. So the discrepancy between happiness and anger cannot be worked out. That leaves FMRI, which I think really will be promising in the future as a tool. It does have some logistical limitations, quite obviously. It is rather tight quarters to be in an fMRI machine. To stay in that for more than the hour that is common would be pretty unpleasant. It has been described by some people as coffin-like experience or claustrophobic. I don't suffer from claustrophobia myself, so it was an acceptable experience, but certainly some people might find it difficult. Beyond that, it is expensive, and it is going to improve over time. This is an area that in the time that I've run my company has made a lot of progress, and I expect the next 5 to 10 years will bring still more progress. I would probably say outside of the logistical and cost issues, from my perspective, having talked to scientists and had an opportunity to experience being inside an fMRI machine, I would really move to a couple of different issues. One is that there is still a difficulty with keeping track of the timing. So while timing is a virtue for EEG and spatial resolution is a difficulty, it is the reverse for fMRI. And the second thing is simply that the brain is very complicated, and we are, in this case, fortunately taking into account all parts of the brain. But as these quotes are indicating, every part of the brain effectively tells multiple stories. And as Dr. Polzak suggested to me, the best way to handle the tool at present would be certainly in correlation to other measures. So in our case, we're looking to do so in tying it into facial coding so that we can stay in the scientific realm. Clearly one could do that with self-report ratings as a correlation factor, but those correlations and a chance to try to tease out the potential meanings of brain signals would be probably, I believe from my sources, the most faithful way to use the tool at present, though it will be, unlike every other tool we're talking here, the one that's going to make the most advancement and change in the foreseeable future. So those are the slides I have time to cover today. I look forward to the conversation, and I thank everyone for participating in the session.